Welcome to the fourth installment of the WRJ Women Act webinar series. My name is Marcy Frost, and I am a former member of the WRJ Board of Directors. And we have with us Allie Mallinger, who is the Advocacy and Communications Associate for WRJ, and I turn it over to Allie at this time.
Hi, Marcy. Thank you so much. So everyone, welcome. Welcome to the March webinar within the WRJ Women Act series. So with the WRJ Advocacy Plan announced in January of 2017 and identified 6 high priority social justice issues that help shape our advocacy work and focus our efforts in making a positive difference. These issues include pay equity, violence against women, women's health and reproductive rights, economic justice, Israel, and immigration reform. Within this series, we have been able to discuss many aspects of these issues, including current Supreme Court issues, or rather cases, women's health programming around Breast Cancer Awareness Month, pending legislation revolving around immigration reform, and the current state of reproductive rights. I'll turn it back to Marcy to explain today's topic, which is human trafficking, which falls under our Violence Against Women portfolio.
Thank you. Known as the modern-day form of slavery, human trafficking is a crime under federal and international law. Human trafficking affects individuals across the world, including here in the United States, and is commonly regarded as one of the most pressing human rights issues of our time. Human trafficking affects every community in the United States across age, gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic backgrounds, even though each state individually has legislation against any form of trafficking. In this session, we will discuss what this slavery looks like today, ways to be more aware of its signs, and real-time interventions to stop this multi-billion-dollar business. We have 2 expert speakers for today's webinar. Edee Franklin, want to wave, Edee? Edee is the founder of Sanctum House, a 2-year residential treatment program for adult women who are survivors of human trafficking in Detroit, Michigan. Each survivor who comes to live at Sanctum House will enter a 2-year program that includes drug and alcohol rehabilitation, as well as education, counseling, job training, and support. This is Detroit's first safe house and recovery program for women who have been victims of trafficking. Edee is also an associate real estate broker, balancing her time between both professions. We also have Rebecca Cambreleng. Rebecca is an experienced trial attorney from Portland, Oregon, with focuses on advising, counseling, and advocating for clients in the areas of employment, employee benefits, and general business law. She works with both businesses and individuals on their employment law needs, including disability accommodation, hiring and termination, leave law compliance, discrimination, and wage and hour issues. She also acts as outside in-house counsel for small businesses, helping them get established and continuing to advise them as they grow. She also spends her time giving back to the community as one of the founding members of a local volunteer organization aimed at bringing awareness to the issues of domestic child sex trafficking. She serves on the Multnomah Bar Association's membership committee and is a member of Oregon Women Lawyers and the Oregon Trial Lawyers Association.
Thank you so much, Marcy. So we're going to turn it over to Edee in just a second. You'll notice a Q&A and chat feature on your bar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to ask them, but following both Edee and Rebecca's presentations, we'll have a session for Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over.
Hello, is that me? Okay, hi, Edee Franklin actually, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me for this webinar. I'm very excited to be on it. I want to just clear up one thing. We are in Detroit metro area. We're actually in Oakland County, and we are the first safe house in southeastern Michigan, not Detroit, but southeastern Michigan for long-term treatment care for adult women survivors of human trafficking, and it is a 2-year program. So, but today we're going to look beneath the surface as to what human trafficking really is. And I know a lot of people don't want to see what's going on with it. So we kind of turned our heads and a blind eye, but we really can't be silent anymore. Once we know better, we actually have to do better. And that's where we're at today. So the next slide. We're going to talk about what human trafficking is. And I know all of us, we either have an idea of what it looks like, we have an idea of what it is, or we have no idea what it is. And I don't know our audience if you're very aware of it or not aware of it at all. But today, I'm hoping to give you some indication of what are the signs of human trafficking, as well as what we can do to make a difference. And each of us has something that we can add next. It's important to know that, in fact, slavery still exists. It did not cease in World War II. It did not cease after Egypt and the exodus out of Egypt. It just kept going on and on and on. And today, the difference is that slavery exists, but we call it by a better name, supposedly. We call it human trafficking. Next. We also need to know that human trafficking is not smuggling. It is not transportation. And it most likely doesn't look exactly like you think it's going to look, because we have these visions of what it is. The two most prevalent types of human trafficking are labor trafficking and sexual exploitation. We talk about sexual exploitation more than we do about labor trafficking, but let it not go unnoticed. It can be the vulnerable child, as you see here, or even so much as right next door. It's like people think it happens over there. It isn't just over there. It's right here. It's in our neighborhoods. It's in our cities. It's happening to the most vulnerable amongst us. So it could be right in your neighborhood, could be the house next door to you that has a nanny or a maid that they're working.
Edee, I think we're
Properly,
losing you.
not having any freedom. Okay. What do you want me to do?
You're back. We're good.
Okay. So in Michigan, we have migrant workers that come in the summertime to pick fruit and to pick in the fields. So you have people that are working there. And also think about your landscapers. Oftentimes people are brought in just for summer work. So it's all over around us. And then the other piece is, as it says on here, is it child prostitution. That, in fact, is an oxymoron. There is no such thing as child prostitution. Children are prostituted. If you're under 18 years of age, you cannot choose to be a prostitute. And we need to really take a look at that. So in some parts of the country, they will be arrested for prostitution and they will be prosecuted as a criminal. So that's not only morally wrong, it's also illegal to do. So we need to really think about that. If you see the picture, when we're objectifying young girls and women, we're setting them up to be vulnerable and to be taken advantage of. Next slide. So how do we actually define human trafficking? There are three specific elements to human trafficking. All do not have to exist at the same time, but any one of them, given the intensity and what it is, are present. One is force, which is I keep you by force, I confine you, I beat you into submission. The next is fraud, which includes deception and lies. I lie to you, I tell you you're coming here for a good job, I'm going to pay you when you get here, I take away your ID, or I don't give you the job, or I don't pay you what I'm supposed to give you, or I keep you captive. So I fraudulently bring arranged marriages are a perfect example of this in certain countries, or even here actually. And coercion. Coercion is the threat of physical harm. I am going to harm you and beat you into submission. I'm going to coerce you to stay here because if you don't, I'm going to deport you. You don't have documents, you're illegal, you get deported. So I'm often threatening you constantly to stay because you think something bad is going to happen to you if you leave. I think it's really, really important that we recognize the fact in human trafficking, compliance is not consent. Really important. Compliance means survival. Often victims do what they do because it's a survival technique. I don't want to be beaten. I would like to eat. I will do this so I eat. I don't want somebody to harm my children, so I will do it. I'm protecting my family. This, in fact, is compliance, not consent. Next. So who are the victims? The victims, I need the next slide. Who are the victims? The victims are anybody and anyone. The victim is the kid at school, your children's friends, your friends, people that are making your clothes, either overseas or in sweatshops right here in America. I mean, they are worked for 14 hours, 18 hours, whatever, and not paid. They have to sleep where they work. It can be anyone. It's your next door neighbor. It's anybody that is vulnerable, and it's important to know it's the people that are picking your coffee for free trade labor, people that are making your clothes. We need to be more vigilant in what we see. So we go to the next slide, which talks about the myths of human trafficking. One, all prostitutes are willing. That is simply not true. Very often, prostitution starts as a young girl, 14, 15, 16. They are groomed. They are addicted so that they will comply. And they stay because they feel they have no place else to go. I know Sanctum House, that's how we decided to become an organization. They have nowhere to go for healing. They are not traumatized, and they're going to get better in 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. They need long-term care. So that's a real necessity around the entire country and around the entire world right now as a place for shelter. So they don't see a way to see themselves, and the bottom line is they have given up hope. They don't see a way for themselves. Next slide. All immigrants are smuggled into the United States, enter willingly. They do not enter willingly. They may make a decision to come here, but once they hit our shores, they may make a decision to come across the borders. They can be smuggled, or once they get to the shore, they are often turned over to what they thought was going to be their trafficker, their employer, but it turns out that it is in fact their trafficker. Again, a situation where someone is arrested for illegal immigration charges because they couldn't produce proper documentation, don't make the assumption that they were smuggled here and are, in fact, a criminal. Victims of human trafficking are coerced. I just want to read this to you because it's really important. And this is slide 9. Victims of human trafficking are coerced fraudulently into trafficking, while smuggling cases include those who freely and knowingly consent. Victims are exploited while the act of smuggling ends when the migrants get to their intended destination. Movement from place to place does not make trafficking. Trafficking is not transportation. And some victims actually travel willingly and legally to the United States with proper documentation. But once they get here, they are forced into trafficking. Next slide. I like to always say, if it doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. This is slide 10, huh? If it doesn't look right, it probably isn't right. I tell the story about massage parlors and nail salons. Who do you think is not getting paid when they're offering up a mani and a pedi for $13? Okay, the salon can't stay open. The women aren't getting taken care of. Think about hotel workers that don't talk, waiters and waitresses that live where they sleep, beggars on the street. Sometimes traffic victims are groomed from the time they're little up, and it's a hereditary thing. You're born into it, and you just continue to do it. So it's really important that you realize that it's so hidden in plain sight. Next slide. Where do they get help? Okay, so if something doesn't look right, I'm sorry. There are signs I think it's the other thing is that you should not approach a traffic victim yourself. You can put yourself in harm's way. You can put the victim in harm's way. So you need to report it either to your local authorities or remember the National Human Trafficking Hotline number, which is 888-3737-888, or go to the PolarisProject.org hotline. That is now, if you see something, you should report it. One of the reasons we don't have a lot of statistics is there is not a global or even local databases. So we only know that it's going on everywhere. We don't necessarily know all of the numbers. We know it's a $150 billion industry. We know those kinds of numbers. But if you report it to Polaris, they will start to identify where it's happening, what it's happening, and you can go on their website and find out lots of information. So don't do it yourself. They'll call the right people. Next slide. What can you do? It's really the main question. What can I do? I want to get involved. Well, you can become a monthly donor to any human trafficking organization that you like. Free the slaves. You can donate to Sanctum House. That would be really great. We can always use money. Go to continue to learn and educate others. Do a TED Talk. You only need to save one life. Consider life. And you can change lives and legacies. Consider opening a shelter. We need them so desperately. And there are less than 500 beds across the country for long-term treatment for women survivors or survivors of human trafficking in a long-term treatment center. Learn to teaching, initially getting into our schools and educating our children. That's really, really important. Buy free trade products. And I just want to say this one thing. It's coming to be Passover. And I would suggest at your Seder table, if you're Jewish, to ask a fifth question. And the fifth question is, why is this night not different than any other night? And it's not different because there are millions of slaves all over the world still not being able to make a free decision. So we're asked also to not only remember the Exodus, we're asked to experience it. I say thank you for being open to this topic of human trafficking. And just remember that when one of us is not free, none of us are free. So thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Edee. I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to tackle the legal and Jewish perspectives of human trafficking. Edee gave you a great introduction to what human trafficking looks like and how you can find it. So I'm going to start with the legal perspective. If we could go to the next slide. So we're going to discuss the rights of the trafficking victims. So when a victim is identified and they are brought to the police or they are brought to a sanctuary, there's certain rights and needs that they have that you can help with. I'm going to talk about why this is a Jewish issue, because that is one of the questions we get when we, in our group, the Portland Jewish Response Group, our goal was to bring awareness to the Jewish community. And one of the questions we got a lot of the time is, well, this isn't really a Jewish issue, is it? It's a human issue, but why should the Jews care? And you'd be surprised how many people actually said that. Finally, I'm going to talk about actually some current legislation that just happened yesterday. So it's kind of a very interesting time right now. Next slide. So different types of trafficking. Edee touched on this. I'm really going to go through it quickly. So there's sex trafficking. So these are people who are being used for sexual purposes. You see this a lot in gangs. Gang activity really is, sex trafficking has become one of the #1 illegal enterprises that gangs kind of engage in, because you can sell a woman multiple times. You can only sell drugs or a gun once. Labor trafficking. This is a very important issue, less about what we focus on in our group, but labor trafficking, we see it everywhere. It's migrant farm workers. There was actually a kosher butcher somewhere in the Midwest, and I don't really remember the details, but I know that they were under investigation for labor trafficking, which would have made it a non-kosher facility if they were actually holding slaves, and I just learned that. And then there's a combination, the massage parlors where they're being put to work and they're being sold for sex. As Edee was saying, the victims were criminalized for many, many years, and in some places they still are. Prostitution is a crime. So these women who started in the life when they were children being trafficked were being prosecuted for something that they really had no control over. a lot of states now have started focusing on laws that actually criminalize the criminal behavior, which is selling of another human being and buying of another human being. So focusing on those individuals. And it is also not just the crime of the prostitution itself or the sex itself, but it is other light crimes. It's a really big issue for women and boys who are sold while they're under the influence of their traffickers, being it a gang or an individual trafficker. They are a lot of the times forced to do other crimes. So burglary, theft, assault, go steal that 40 from a liquor store, whatever it happens to be, and they get in trouble for those light crimes. So if you want to go to the next slide. Basically, the problem that we see when we criminalize the victims is that there are consequences even after the victims get out of the life. And so you have problems with employment. Most employers these days do criminal background checks, and they can see if you have crimes for the prostitution, or even if it's not for prostitution, if it's for assault or any kind of fraud, you will not be offered a job. Housing. This is a big, big problem for women. When there is a prostitution charge on their record, they will not get a house because it is a huge liability for landlords to rent to women who have been involved with drugs and prostitution and all of that. Economic assistance. You talk about a lot of these women coming out are coming from nothing. They have they have problems getting housing, problems getting jobs, and that means they need economic assistance such as food stamps and health care. They need the government to step in. But again, the government's going to look and say, okay, we've got some problems here. And these are bureaucrats. They're just doing paper. They're not taking a look at, oh, this woman specifically came out of the life of human trafficking, and so she needs to be given a little bit more leeway. That's not going to happen. Immigration status, especially these days, is a huge concern for these women where they might have been trafficked against their will into this country, and they need to apply for a U visa or a T visa. There's some immigration options for them to help them stay in this country once they get free of their trafficker, but those programs are being scrutinized heavily by this administration, as you can probably guess. Next slide. So there are a lot of states, and I've been involved in some of the work here in Oregon, where we're trying to pass laws that allow the victims to either expunge, which means to get rid of any convictions that stem from their trafficking, or to seal them so that people cannot see them on a standard background check. What that individual has to show in a lot of these states is that they were doing those crimes while they were the victim of a trafficker, and they were doing it under that duress of a trafficker. And there are many states, and Oregon is one of them, where the police and district attorneys have actually started forming these task force so that they can identify victims and they can work to make sure that they're getting the right criminals. They're getting the buyers, they're getting the sellers. They are not prosecuting these women. And it's a lot of training, and it's a lot of work just above, what we think of as normal police work. They have to interact with these women, figure out, are they being coerced? Are they not? Generally they are. And build relationships, because a trafficking victim isn't going to see a police officer and go, oh, thank God you're here, you're going to save me. They're going to go, oh no, I'm going to get in trouble. And what we didn't talk about was the relationship between the victim and their trafficker, and how there's a bond that grows there, basically under duress. And a lot of the times they have children with them, so they see the police officer, they think, oh no, and they want to run away. So the police officers really have to work at gaining the trust, and it can take a few times of these women coming in and out of the system for them to start learning to trust the police officers. Next slide. So there's also a lot of other issues that come out of it for the victims. Domestic rights. Like I said, a lot of these women, especially where they're, individual traffickers, they get married to them, they have children with them, and so they have to deal with all of those issues, maybe divorce, custody, restraining orders, once they realize how unhealthy their relationship is and how they were a victim. A lot of them don't see themselves as victims. They finally, some of them feel like they're getting their power back, and this man, yeah, he's forcing me to do all this stuff, but he gives me money, he gives me a place to live, he gives me the drugs I need. So it's this weird, not weird, but it's a dynamic that's very unhealthy. And it's, once they realize that it is an unhealthy dynamic, they try and get some of their power back. employment. There's also a really interesting litigation coming out of this where these women are suing their traffickers for violation of wage and hour laws. So they're not being paid for this work that they're doing. And it's another hook to try and get these traffickers some kind of accountability. Not the best, necessarily the best way to go about it, but we're trying to find a way to give them some of that power back. And this is a hook into it. There's also victims' rights associations. So when these victims need access to that information, they're victims' rights advocates who are there to help them get restitution, which is money from either the trafficker who has to pay fines or some kind of fund. Every jurisdiction is different there. And we talked about housing, economic assistance, employment, immigration. There's a lot of help that these women need, and men too, but generally women, but that these victims need when they get out of the life. Next slide. So the question we get a lot is, why is this a Jewish issue? Well, a couple of reasons. We're going to talk about tikkun olam, which I think everybody knows what that is. We're going to talk about slavery, which Edee touched on as well. And this is our men, and these are our children. So next slide. So tikkun olam, which for Reform Jews, as we know, is really one of the big tenets of what we live by, which is to repair the world. There is this idea now that when we talk about tikkun olam, we talk about how this really is a social action issue. We have the social action group here. Most synagogues have them. We're pursuing social justice, and this is a huge area for social justice where you've got slavery. It's nothing more than modern slavery, and as Jews, we have lived through this many, many, many times in our history. And like Edee was saying, Passover's coming up. It is a week-long celebration of being freed from being slaves. But there's still slaves out there. And it is our responsibility to start bringing light to these slaves, because people don't realize it. They don't think about it this way. They think about it as some of these women are making a choice, especially when they're over the age of 18. It's like this switch in the head that gets turned. Well, this woman is 19 and she is a prostitute. So obviously this is her choice. Well, you know, it's entirely possible she got into life when she was 11 or 12 or 16. And it doesn't stop once they turn 18. It doesn't become, I am a victim, to I am somebody with power over my own life. I am a victim and I continue to be a victim, even over the age of 18. And that's where we lose a lot of people who say, oh, well, they're adults. They should be able to take care of themselves. It's not how it works. People who start being victimized at a young age, and when you talk to these victims, most of them from early childhood on have been victims in some form or another. They're the ones who continue on as victims in their life until they get the help that they need. You can see that Maimonides, I don't know how to say this, Maimonides? I don't know. He was a very popular rabbi, very scholarly rabbi, and talked about how important it is to free those who are slaves, because they're in life that's not their choice. This isn't their choice. This isn't their life. It's somebody else's life who's living it for them, and it's terrifying. Next slide. So why do we care? Well, on top of all the esoteric, you know, we are Jews, we should help everybody issue, our men are the ones buying sex, okay? This is hard for people to believe. Everybody says, well, we're Jews. Statistically, we have lower rates of domestic violence. We have lower rates of foster parenting. We have lower rates of this, that, and the other thing when you take a look at it. Yeah, we might have lower rates, but there are still people who are engaging in this activity. So we talk about our men. Our men are middle-aged, middle-income, white males with white-collar jobs, and they're married. Who does that sound like? That sounds like Jewish men. That sounds like Christian men. That sounds like every male, okay? There is no average anything. It's everybody, all right? And it's people you don't expect. There have been priests, there have been rabbis, there have been police officers, there's been lawyers and judges. All of these people have been found to have been buying sex. So don't think for a second that just because, you know, I'm a Jew, that your man might not be buying sex. He might be. I don't know. Our children, okay? Our children are being trafficked. It is not a non-Jew issue. It is not non-Jewish children. It's not just Christian children or children without religion who are being trafficked. It doesn't matter what their religion is. Trafficker doesn't go up to him and say, so you're Jewish, right? All right, never mind. I'm not going to take you, or I'm not going to, you know, start forming a relationship with you. It's not how that works. And in fact, we have a local rabbi here in Portland, Oregon, who has been trying to help this woman she's been trafficked actually from the East Coast over here, and he's trying to help her escape from her trafficker. And it's a very difficult process, but it kind of brings it home. It's in every community. There's no safe community. It's a lot of these are vulnerable teens who are already feeling bad about themselves. Somebody starts showing interest in them, and there you go. Next slide. So really interesting, just happened yesterday, actually. So there is a bill that just got passed out of the Senate and the House. They did it yesterday, so there's something called the Decency Act, and it has protected online sites like Backpage and Craigslist from being prosecuted for the content that is posted by users on their websites. And this has been around since the 90s. There was a lot of give and take back when it was first passed, because there's a big issue with free speech. And if I'm hosting a website and allowing people to post advertisements on it, why should I be held accountable for what they are saying? I can't, monitor everything that goes through. Well, yesterday, the Senate and the House passed, or the Senate passed what the House has already passed, which is a basically revision to the Decency Act that says, yeah, you know what, Backpage specifically, this is really aimed at Backpage, but you big, internet posters who are allowing people to sell sex on your website and child pornography on your websites, we're going to start holding you accountable. The Senate, there were only 2 no votes, and it was really surprising to me to learn that one of them was Ron Wyden, who is one of our Democratic senators from Oregon. And I kind of didn't understand it until I looked and found that he was one in the original legislation that was passed who was very concerned that this could trickle down as far as free speech is concerned. The question is, where do you draw the line? And this gets into a lot of kind of legal arguing and concepts that I'm not necessarily going to get into now, but suffice it to say that it's going to be passed by the White House is actually going to sign on to this, and it's going to give the police and attorneys the ability to pursue these online vendors of trafficking victims, Backpage, Craigslist, where everybody's trafficked pretty much online now. It's rare to have people wandering the streets. You look up online, you say, okay, here's a woman who's ready for sex, and I'm going to order her up. A lot of different states are having their own local legislation. There's a lot of activism going on, and I don't have time to look up what's happening in all 50 states, but if you're interested in this issue, I would definitely take a look at what's going on in your own state, in your own backyard, and see if they are working towards decriminalizing the victims, finding ways to expunge the records or seal the records of these victims, and so forth. Next slide. So, Edee touched on all this, so what can you do? Well, education. That's one of the first big things. First, educate yourself, right? There are many documentaries, there's books, there's online videos that talk about what is sex trafficking, what is labor trafficking, what is human trafficking. And then contact the local organizations. If you go to the Polaris Project, which Edee talked about, they can actually point you to a local chapter of something that can help. So Rotary Club is a big one. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Rotary Club is huge into working on trafficking victims. They actually leave hotel soaps in hotels and motels where women are being trafficked with numbers on them for them to text and call. Rest stop bathrooms. That's a big push people are doing, is to put stickers in the bathrooms for rest stops so that women who have to run to the bathroom and are being trafficked through that area might be able to text and be saved. And there's also smaller, like education-based organizations like Yes, and they're all going to escape my head right now because I don't have them written down, but there's a lot in your local area that is working to educate children on this issue, especially in the teen years. So volunteering, this is a big one, and it goes with being a foster parent. Most people can't be foster parents. A lot of that I understand. But if you can, a lot of these kids who get trafficked into life are coming from really bad situations. And so fostering is a way to help, volunteering, giving these kids a lifeline for those who need it, especially at a young age when you're forming these attachment issues. Those are really big. Form awareness groups. You know, we started this Portland Jewish Response Group specifically because this was not an issue being discussed and we wanted it to be discussed. Lobby, protests, be heard. I mean, just start calling your representatives. Pay attention to what's going on in the legislature, at the state level too. That's even more important sometimes than the federal, because that's where laws get made that's going to affect people in your community. And donating. That's, everybody's like, well, what can I do? I want to really dig in and help. I want to be a counselor. And that's great if you have really specific skill sets. But if not, there are organizations that really need your donations to help those with the skill sets help these victims. And interestingly, police officers actually really need funds, because what part of the way they form relationships with these girls is to give them Starbucks and McDonald's gift cards and maybe a Target gift card, and they start handing it out and they realize that these guys aren't all bad, and women. So I think that's all for me, and I guess going back to Allison.
Thank you so much, both to Edee and Rebecca, for all of your knowledge and expertise. I'm actually going to pass it to Marcy. So you can, now we're going to start our question and answer section. So if you have any questions for either speaker or both speakers on this topic or related topics that they may be able to answer, feel free to put them in the chat and or the question and answer section on your toolbar. Thank you.
Well, so far we don't have any questions in there, but I was interested in, Edee, at the beginning of yours, you were talking about the force or fraud as being one factor and coercion as being a separate factor. Can you explain sort of the difference between those two factors?
Yeah, absolutely, I can. Okay, so force is, you know, I mean, I'm going to just read it to you, even though I know it so like the back of my hand. But force is, I keep you against your will. I force you to do something. I chain you in the basement. I tell you you have to do this, and I force you to do it. I drug you, and I force you to have sex with 20 people or whatever it is. Fraud is, I fraudulently coerce you into doing this under a misconception. I fraudulently say to you, I'm going to give you a really good job and pay you this. Why don't you sign up for this job? And you do, and then when you come in, I force you to stay, and then I don't pay you what I promised you. So I give you a fraudulent offer, and I don't keep my promise. So it's like a broken promise. When I coerce you into doing something, I tell you lies. I say, you can come and do this. Come to America. Come to my migratory workers. Come do this. But I coerce you into doing it because I say to you, if you don't do it, I have all your documentation, I'm going to deport you. If you don't do it, I'm going to kill your family. I'm going to not feed you. I'm going to do bodily harm to you or the people that you care about. So I coerce you into staying because you do not want to be you don't want to feel guilty about being the cause of harm to other people.
Okay, thank you. Now we do have some questions. So Julia Weinstein, who is a vice president of Women of Reform Judaism, wants to know how each of the presenters got involved in this important work. So Rebecca, would you like to go first, and then Edee?
Sure. I was working at a very large law firm in New York City, and one of the things they allowed us to do was to get involved in pro bono work, which means giving out legal services for free. And it happened to be that one of the needs was for a U visa program, which was to help women who were trafficked into the country or who are the victims of domestic violence to stay in the country. And so it kind of opened my eyes. I had no idea this was a problem at all. I didn't even realize human trafficking was really a thing. It was not on my radar. So I started doing that, and that ever since I've been doing this kind of work.
And I got involved in this work. I always say that people look back into their history to the first book you write is always about yourself. And every year I do some kind of a self-searching kind of a program. I did landmark education I did it 5 years ago. And in that I had to find something missing in the community that was not there. And I was hearing a lot about human trafficking and human trafficking awareness. And as I looked in it, I realized that there were no shelters. And in my youth, I was a heroin addict for 10 years, and I lived in a shelter for 1.5 years. And I knew that without long-term treatment, women at risk are considered throwaways. And so I decided that, seeing as there weren't many shelters, and in southeastern Michigan there were none, that I would open one. And so I went on a quest to get a following and get people behind me so that in fact we could open a long-term treatment facility. And now we can, and we have 4 residents, and we will house up to 16. And we're very excited to be the first in southeastern Michigan, and only right now.
All right, thank you. And then Eileen Berger asked, is the Polaris Project the best resource to Google to understand how her state, which is New York, is dealing or not dealing with the issue, and how one might make a difference? So is Polaris Project a good place to start?
Polaris Project is it's the go-to website for every state, every country. It does everything. It gives you information, what statistics they have, the hotline, who's calling, what states are going up in call volume. It talks about labor trafficking, sexual exploitation. It covers the gamut of everything. It really is the go-to website for human trafficking information. And then also, it's like I'm on the board of the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force. Look in your own state and see what your own task forces are doing.
Okay, thank you. And then Lindy Henderson commented that many local National Council of Jewish Women chapters are active in this issue. Are either of you aware of anything that NCJW is doing?
Actually, I'm sorry, go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, yeah, I've heard that and seen that, I think, in a few different synagogues in the Pacific Northwest.
NCJW here in Greater Detroit actually sits on our advisory board, as does JVS and JFS. So we have a lot of contact with them, and they're very involved here in the legal aspects. So that's really their take on it, and they do a tremendous amount of awareness programs for not just the Jewish community, but for every community. They're really active.
Yeah, and I would just add that if you are in a sisterhood in a community that also has NCJW, you can certainly do joint programming with NCJW. Then Leslie Breyer has asked, she said that men at our temple are interested in doing something. I heard a talk about Tom Perez from Oregon, who works with local police and local men, posing as traffickers and having the callers identified by police once they are engaged in conversation. Are either of you familiar with this? And is it something that would be appropriate for men in a congregation to get involved with?
Yes. Oh, so actually, this is a man here who actually is up in Vancouver, Washington, which is basically part of Portland. People are going to be really mad at me that I said that. But it's basically in the Portland metro area. But yeah, they actually started this organization where what they do is they work with the local police force, and they get online, and they have people answering phones when men call in. They place fake sex ads on sites like Backpage. And when the men call in, they have a task force sitting there, and they say to the guy, okay, so here's your name, here's your number, here's all your information. And they basically are trying to do something about disrupting the pipeline of sale to buyer. So I was just Googling, because I can't for the life of me, because I've heard him talk. He's come to our synagogues around here. This was a big part of what we were doing as the Portland Jewish Response Group, we had one member who her whole thing was wanting to talk to brotherhoods and getting men involved because men are the buyers. And so if you can disrupt the buyers, you have no product. But it was very, very, very difficult to get the men involved. They don't want to hear about it. They don't want to do anything. Some of them will talk the talk, but maybe every once in a while we'll reach somebody. And so we were trying, but it was kind of discouraging. So it's really encouraging to hear that the men in your synagogue want to do something. So I would definitely reach out to him. I will, my contact information is being sent at the end of this. So go ahead and get in hold of me and I can get you his contact information if you'd like. But he's a really, really good speaker and I think he's willing to speak everywhere. He's gone all over the country. So.
And here in Michigan, we have a guy, his name is Brian Rossi. He has an organization called the Epic Project.
Okay, that's what it is.
Yeah, that's exactly what he does. And he does a phenomenal job. And they're always doing, in different, in synagogues, temples, but in a lot of the churches and stuff where men are really, it's about fighting the demand and stopping the demand. So he's very big on that. And he's a really, he's got a wealth of knowledge. So I'm sure if you reach out to him, you could do it all over there.
Okay, thank you. And then Marla Feldman, the executive director of Women of Reform Judaism, said that there seems to be a debate among activists as to whether outlawing and cracking down on prostitution is an appropriate approach. Some believe prostitution is de facto trafficking in every circumstance, and the only way to stop trafficking is to stop prostitution. Others think that criminalizing it harms the victims, and a better approach is to criminalize the act of going to a prostitute rather than criminalizing the act of prostitution. This discussion debate has been an undercurrent when WRJ has taken policy positions on trafficking. Do you have thoughts about that?
I do.
So do I, but you go first.
Yeah, thank you. The problem is I don't think prostitution itself should be a crime. I think buying a person and selling a person should be the crime. Otherwise, you are harming those who are victims. And that's really what I think. There you go.
And I agree. I think that the same thing. And I know there's a big discussion also about, closing down Backpage and all these websites. I think we need to think about it in two ways. And I haven't come up with a solution in my own brain yet. But if we close them down, because that's a gateway to get to the traffickers, because the trafficking is the crime, not the act, but the trafficking is the crime.
Right.
So if we close down the websites where we can get into the dark web and figure out who they are, we limit our access to them. However, we still, if we keep them open, now we are subjecting all the children and the women and whoever that are being sold on the internet to being sold over and over and over again. I would think about that too.
Okay. Thank you. And that's a really good segue into a question that Harriet Ann Litwin sent in, and it's basically to better understanding of the connection between human trafficking and the dark web.
Well, I think Rebecca said it before, earlier. Prostitution isn't necessarily on the street corner anymore. It's on the internet, pornography, pedophilia, all of that kind of stuff that's going on in the dark web, and the buying and selling and the transporting of children from state to state or country to country is a big business. It's a $150 billion a year industry in general. So I know we have a task force in Detroit and Wayne County that is searching, the internet and going into the dark web. And I'm sure there are the same kinds of organizations all over doing it, because that's how we're going to find them. That's where they are today.
I love the term dark web because it makes you conjure up this image of like a second internet that you have to be really, creepy and criminal to access. And at least that's what pops up in my head. But, this stuff actually happens out in the open. It happens on sites like Craigslist and Backpage. And to kind of say, well, it's this dark web idea. Yeah, there's stuff sold on back sites. There's stuff sold that you have to be really knowledgeable about the internet to get on. But that's an issue for people who really want to work on that. What we're working on, and what I think is easier for the general public to do, is work on what's out in the open, and that is Backpage, and that is dealing with the victims, and that is, you know, gang activity. And, you know, gangs are huge. People don't talk about it enough, but this is the #1 crime of gangs these days, is human trafficking. And I was having this discussion with someone. It's kind of a circular idea that why do we have gangs in the first place? Because we have children who have nowhere else to go. They have no hope. They have schools that have given up on them, communities that have given up on them, and they need support, and they need encouragement, and they go to gangs for a family. So it starts again, this big circle of, well, if we can get kids and protect these children in all walks of life, you know, are they going to enter a gang? No. Are they going to sell? No. Are they going to buy? Who knows about that? But it is, you know, it's not just the dark web. It's stuff that's out in the open. So
it's like people think that all of this happens like the movie Taken.
Right.
Not to say it doesn't happen like Taken, and that I'm not, you know, the movie was exciting and it kept us going. But the reality is it more often happens with, gee, you have pretty eyes. Can I buy you a hamburger? And the young girl is vulnerable and is looking for love and somebody to, you know, compliment them, and they go off with them, and before they know it, that the hamburger turns into, do you have a place to sleep? You can sleep here. And it's more often much more subtle than the dark web, you know, conjures up. I think you're right, Rebecca. It's really way more subtle than that. And the people don't have to be like old traffickers. I have a friend, she was trafficked at 13, her trafficker was 19.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and young people are trafficking their girlfriends and their friends. So it's much less dark, even though it's really dark.
High school girls are trafficking other high school girls. So that's happening too. They have the boyfriend, and the boyfriend says, can you get some friends to come along? And it can start that way. So it's everywhere.
Okay. And then we have time for one last question. And so I'm going to go to a question from Laura Fell. And she asks whether there are former victims who are willing to talk about their experiences once they are out of trafficking life. And I guess I would add, if you were in a sisterhood and wanted to have a speaker like that, where would be the best place to get in contact with someone who'd be willing to talk about their experience?
Well, for us, I have speakers, you know, I have survivors that I know all the time, and we go out and we have survivors speak at presentations. So there's lots of them out there. I mean, I can, you know, I don't know about your specific state. I know here in Michigan, I do know women that go around the country and speak.
Yeah, there are women everywhere who are willing to talk about it. There's videos from victims. That's one way that they can talk without having to have all the scrutiny and the attention on them, and sometimes hiding their faces if they're still scared. But yeah, there's women everywhere who are willing to talk. And again, talk to local community organizations like Rotary Club. They get a lot of speakers. I can't remember.
YouTube, go on YouTube, like you just said. If you go on YouTube, you'll find lots of survivors that have told their stories.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentations and your participation in this question and answer. And I'm going to just turn it back over to Allie.
Thank you so much. I think this has been an extremely informative session within the series. If you have any other questions for some of our expert speakers, you will receive an email following the session with a link to the recording of this session, an evaluation form that you should definitely fill out to make this series even better than it is now. And then a teaser to our next webinar, which you see on your screens. It's on April 10th, which is Equal Pay Day, and we will be discussing the gender wage gap with speakers, Executive Director of WRJ, Rabbi Marla Feldman, Executive Director of Women's Rabbinic Network, Rabbi Mary Zamor, and Michael Gann, who is a legal representative to many of these fair pay cases. So I hope that you all join us. And thank you so much again to our amazing speakers, Edee, Rebecca, and Marcy, for helping moderate this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for having us. This was really fun.
Thanks for
Thank
having us
you.
and for watching.
Glad you all were interested.
Yeah.